Marie Wong, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Well, I'm sure you've been watching and listening to what has been happening in the CID and your thoughts on what's going on there.
Oh my heavens. This is a repeat of history. This is a long-standing problem that governance in Seattle has had with the Asian American community. This has been going on literally ever since the Asian Americans came into Seattle.
So let's start with the history, because that's what you have tracked through the years and through your work. The Chinatown International District, or Asians have been pushed around quite a bit in the city of Seattle. So can you give us a little history of that so that we understand?
Well, briefly, we started seeing Chinese Americans come into Seattle around 1860. And the initial settlement was really one small store that was located around First and Yesler. Meaningful settlement of Chinese America starts happening in Seattle shortly thereafter, when you started to see more businesses, homes, lodging houses that are settling around the Second and Washington area. And then through major decisions, and I'm going to say major public works decisions on the part of the city, you see that withering away of that Chinatown core and the relocation of the community to where it currently is in the King Street, I'm going to say the King Street core neighborhood. So a lot of this was driven by decisions that were made for the improvement of Seattle's transportation ways, for the betterment of a connection between the South downtown area and the Central Business District. So a lot of this was driven by public works, decisions to fill the tide flats, to build a tunnel underneath the downtown, the construction of two railway stations, and the Jackson 12th Avenue and the Dearborn Street regrade projects. And all of that was happening within about a decade's time.
One of the interesting things to me is people don't understand the uniqueness of the Chinatown International District. It's that international portion that people don't understand. How did it become so multicultural and not just a Chinatown?
That I think is probably one of the most unique characteristics of Seattle's Chinatown International District, is the fact that you did see all of these different Asian groups that were settling in and among one another in the same geography. It's not something that you will see in the history of other Asian American communities in the United States. So that alone makes it incredibly unusual. The area was also very multicultural. So it included the Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, African Americans, Eastern Europeans, Western Europeans. And the one thing that they all had in common in settling in the current geography of the CID is that they were poor. So I think it's as important as race is with the issue of what is happening politically with the district today. You also have to look at the economy of the district. Because if you have money, you are going to you're going to be heard in City Hall.
So in your recent op-ed in the Northwest Asian Weekly, one of the things that was stunning to me is the list of indignities our community has had to suffer over the years. And a lot of it was at the hands of government. And that continues today. Could you give us just kind of a quick rundown of all the stuff that has happened to the Chinatown International District?
I would probably have to refer to the writing itself, but if you're looking at this, this was actually an abridged list. That's the other thing that makes it so sad, is that the listing that I included in the commentary was specifically looking at those local decisions that were made that affected the CID. This didn't even include a long list of federal actions, policies, decisions that were made on immigration. One thing that I can add here is that everyone is always talking about fixing the broken immigration system, when in fact, the immigration system never worked. So to say that it's fixed is kind of a misnomer. The listing is basically looking at those same public works projects. When the city wanted to attract the NP station, the construction of rail lines in Seattle, there was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of approval of franchise districts so that they could construct a tunnel that was going to connect the south downtown to the north downtown. So basically the tunnel was constructed from Jackson to Virginia, north of the city. And that decision automatically put the former Chinatown and Japantown area at risk because they were saying, well, we're going to construct this tunnel, and oh, well, Chinatown, that area is really looked at as a very degraded area of the city. So it really didn't matter that some major land use removal of those businesses and homes was going to take place. And because the decision making takes a while to happen, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that Chinatown was going to be affected. And so the Chinese start looking for other opportunities for the purchase of property. Well, by that time, the same thing happened then that's happening now. Property becomes so incredibly valuable, the cost is escalated. And if you're selling a piece of property that they know you can't build on, or that the city is going to take through eminent domain, the value is far less than what it's going to cost you to buy property elsewhere. So the construction of the station, the rail stations, the building of the tunnel that takes place, and all of that's happening at the same time that the city is looking at the filling of the tide flats and undergoing one of the most major regrade projects that had ever taken place in the United States. And all of that is bringing both opportunity for development, but it's also bringing a lot of stress on the removal of the district and the relocation of businesses, the relocation of homes, social organizations that were very important to the rise and the consistency and livability of Asian American communities. So that was happening all at the same time in the early 20th century. And I would love to say that at that point it would have stopped, but it didn't. The city makes a decision in the 1920s that they're going to build a better connection between the north downtown and the south downtown, and they're going to do it by the construction or engaging in the construction of the Second Avenue extension, which virtually ended up taking out what little was left of the Asian American district in that second Washington core. So by 1910, you start to see a lot of businesses and buildings that are being constructed in the district. But it didn't end there either, because they made the decision that they're going to build a public housing project in what was Yesler Terrace. And that project also ends up taking out a big chunk of the Japanese American neighborhood, Chinese American businesses, Filipino American businesses and homes that are located where the current Yesler Terrace project, or what do I call it, the redevelopment of Yesler Terrace. So that ends up taking out a big chunk of the district. At the same time that planning for a major expressway through the city is being done. Even though the project itself doesn't start until the late 1950s, the idea of building an expressway was something that was already being discussed in the late 1930s.
Well, we're talking about I-5, right?
We're talking about I-5. And at that time, they were calling it the expressway. Well, the problem with making that decision is that all of the land along I-5 if you owned a piece of property, no one wanted to put money into their property because they figured, well, we don't know. The city is probably, the federal government is going to make a decision to get rid of all of these homes. And so the district goes into kind of a freeze mode. No money is coming into the district to rehabilitate, to renovate, to restore properties, because they know they're going to be taken away with the construction of the interstate. And that's exactly what happens. So the combination of that project with the city's passage of the Ozark Hotel Ordinance. Now, let me back up a little bit. The Ozark Hotel Ordinance was basically passed after two major fires that had taken place in the downtown area. Now, neither one of those fires had occurred in the CID. They were both in the north end of the downtown. But the city was, at that time, really nervous about what was going to happen, because both of these fires had created a loss of lives and a loss of property. Now, the city had an ordinance in effect that would have protected those individuals who were living in these buildings, but it wasn't really something that had been enforced. The real issue of enforcement takes place because the city is basically scared about lawsuits. That unless they are making sure that these ordinances are enforced, they are setting themselves up for lawsuits, which is exactly what happened with the families of those individuals who had died in the Ozark Hotel fire. So rather than think about the ramifications, the future ramifications of what it would mean to pass an all-encompassing ordinance that ultimately ends up closing low-income housing that was provided through residential hotels, there was really no thought about what that was going to mean long-term. I'm going to say, with the exception of looking at, well, those individuals who live in residential hotels that can't meet the then contemporary code will probably lose about 1,000 units of housing. That was the projection that was made by the city.
So the impact was specifically hard on the International, the Chinatown area.
It was definitely hard. It was hard, I'm going to say, for both low-income housing, because SRO hotels provided the bulk of low-income housing located in downtown Seattle. And the majority of those buildings were located south of Yesler Way, so affecting the Chinatown International District and also those SROs that were in Pioneer Square. Yeah. So the ordinance, I'm going to say in very quick speed, made the decision that now all major doors leading up to the residences are going to be locked. Now, if you look at an SRO, the topology of an SRO is that you've got main floor or at-grade commercial businesses, and then between 2 and 6 stories of low-income residential units in that building. So it's a mixed-use building that was really intended to provide homes for low-income individuals, migrant workers, and immigrants.
What is an SRO? Pardon me.
I'm sorry. An SRO is a single-room occupancy residential hotel. And the city, after the fire, the city makes the decision that now all of these main entry doors are going to be closed. This would have been a first, because if you were accessing, or if you're living in one of these hotels, the main door entry will take you up to the second floor. That's where you're going to check in and have your room assigned. So the closing of these doors basically adds a problem of, well, how are we going to make sure that patrons who want to stay in our hotels are able to get into the buildings themselves? And they had to build fire doors that you would replace the doors of all of these units with fire safety doors, that you would add peepholes, that you would take out transom windows. And the expense of doing something like this, the estimate was that it would cost $11,000. Now, this was in 1970, 1971 dollars, then it would cost at least $11,000 to just replace the doors.
So what was the net result of this ordinance?
The net result was it was devastating. In adding to the city's homeless, it closed the hotels because the majority of these hotels were owned by small concerns, family associations, small business concerns, small corporations, that if you knew that you had to bring your entire building up to code and you had less than a year to do it, and you had no funding, the ordinance was passed, but there was no funding that was available for any of the property owners to access in order to stay in business.
So it's what we would call today mitigation, right? Mitigation funds were not available.
Yeah, there was absolutely no mitigation for this whatsoever.
Yeah.
The bottom line for the loss of housing is that when you combine what was happening with I-5 and the closure of the hotels that was taking place so rapidly, that estimated 1,000 unit loss for the entire downtown ends up being over 3,000 units of lost housing in the CID alone.
So the CID becomes really almost this pawn in a sense, because whenever they want to take some type of action, and I'm talking about government or city and public works, they end up taking it, taking the hit.
Yeah, that's it. That's basically it in a nutshell. It's amazing because the city is always talking about all of the neighborhoods of Seattle assuming their share of addressing issues of homelessness, addressing issues of access. But if you look at it, such as the expansion of this homeless center that they're now talking about doing, when was the last time that we saw a proposal like this being presented to the residents of Mercer Island, to the Laurelhurst neighborhoods? We're not seeing it. We're seeing it in a neighborhood that, unfortunately, and this kind of goes back to the economics of the neighborhood, that if you're always fighting to just survive, how are you possibly going to get the ear of City Hall? And it's sad, but it's true. And the only way that we can do it is really through the numbers of people who are willing to go out there and to have a voice in city governance, and to keep pushing.
Really what we're seeing here is history repeating itself.
Time and time again, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's really sad. I mentioned that I find this professionally embarrassing. As a community planner, before I started teaching at the university, I spent a lot of years working in community development and community planning with the city of San Diego and with private planning consulting in Orange County. And to see the neighborhood not brought in when they have an initial idea of what they're going to do, it really should start at the very, very beginning of the idea. I mean, that's really what self-actualization and self-determination was all about. That was a huge planning movement in the 1960s. It was a grassroots effort because people were tired of watching what was happening to their neighborhoods. They were sick and tired of having federal highways cut their neighborhoods in half. They were tired of seeing historic homes and places of cultural interest basically devastated by major public works projects. So self-determination of neighborhoods starts to rise in the 1960s. And I'm afraid that that's where we're at again.
So right now, do you think that the Chinatown International District is at an existential crossroads, that if these public works projects or whatever they're called, like the Sound Transit Station, the mega shelter, will that cause a demise of the CID? I mean, are we at that point?
I don't think that there's any question that we're at that point. And we're seeing this happening in Asian American neighborhoods all across the United States. That for some reason, and I am not certain why, but there seems to be this idea that if we close or remove an area that has taken 100 years, 160 years to build, that somehow or another we can rebuild that. And history has told us that we can't. That a neighborhood like the CID, it didn't happen instantly, and we're not going to be able to replace it instantly if we go ahead and we engage in a project that is going to freeze the district for better than a decade. The whole idea is so preposterous that anyone who is in the planning profession should be sitting back and scratching their head and trying to figure out who on earth would have promoted such an incredibly insane idea. But the district is definitely at a crossroads. There is absolutely no doubt in the minds of the people who live and work in the district, nor anyone who is engaged in any kind of community development.
Are the issues that Seattle is facing, again, it's public works. We're talking about the Sound Transit issue. We're also talking about this expansion of this homeless shelter. Are they similar in Chinatowns elsewhere in the country? I know New York is facing big issues as well.
No, absolutely. And I think that if you just get on Google and you start to you type in the demise of Asian American communities, or the demise of Chinatown, so many articles will start to pop up. Philadelphia is going through this right now because they're talking about the construction of a stadium that is close to Chinatown. Does any of this sound familiar?
Right. Yeah.
That has happened over the years. I've watched what has happened with Portland's Old Town Chinatown neighborhood. I mean, when you think about it, Portland's Chinatown at one time it was the largest geographic Chinatown in North America. And now we're talking about an area that is still recognized by the National Register as being a 10-block area. But if you go into that neighborhood, there's no Chinatown there.
No, there's a gate and a museum.
Right. The Gateway, the museum, and
the garden.
And the Benevolent Association. So you're talking about 4 major institutions, 3 of which are more contemporary, but all of the businesses are gone. The restaurants are gone. The homes are gone. In fact, the homes were probably the first to leave the neighborhood. But this is an incredibly serious thing to have happen. I think rather than look at how could we shore up the neighborhood, how can we put money behind the proposals to save the CID, we're not seeing that happening. And without that, the neighborhood is in tremendous risk. The DEIS that was done for Sound Transit 3, there were some major things that were missing in this, even from the first couple of pages that you look at. One of them is looking at how that document was dispersed with people who would be interested in accessing it, and definitely those people in the CID.
Yeah.
That the document is free if you have access to the internet. Now, I don't know how many people have actually looked at this document, but the summary alone is over 60 pages. So to access this document is going to take a tremendous amount of effort on anybody that wants to know, what is in this.
Right.
Now,
and that's the environmental impact statement that we're talking
I'm sorry,
about.
yes, that's the draft environmental impact statement,
right,
for Sound Transit 3. And so your other option is to pay for a hard copy of the document, which will run $25 for the main copy, and then $10 to $15 for every one of the appendices that is part of the document. And now, if you look at that against the demographics of the district. And you know that about a third of the people who live in the district are at or below the federal poverty line. Are they really going to have the money to spend on a document when you are trying to feed your family, pay ever increasing rents that are happening in the CID? It's ridiculous to even think about it like that. The document also does not include the no action alternative. And I believe that it should have included that. They said that they considered it, but in the draft environmental impact statement, that is not included as one of the possible alternatives rather than build out of Sound Transit 3. I'm disturbed by the whole project because Seattle, and this is probably going to age me, or it's going to date my age, but it's flim-flam. That if you look at the bill of goods that was sold to the residents of Seattle, let's just take the streetcar alone. They build the North Lake Union segment. They build the First Hill segment that ends up causing considerable damage to the CID during the years that it was under construction. But they don't have the money, and they have tabled the idea of building the section that would connect the north and the south streetcar lines. We can't even finish that. Then there was all of the money that was wasted and spent on planning the monorail that was somehow going to be the answer to connect West Seattle.
And that was a huge doggle, let's face that. You know,
that was a huge, huge expenditure of money for planning a system that
went nowhere.
Went absolutely nowhere.
Right.
I'm going to say, with the exception of land that was purchased for the future stations that never got built, and then the city ends up having that land that they end up selling. So we can't finish one project. I don't know how many people have driven in the downtown. I did a couple of weeks ago just to see what has torn up, and basically everything is.
Right.
So maybe it would be good to enact a larger moratorium to slow all of this down so that we can really engage in thoughtful community interaction to make thoughtful, long-range decisions for what will happen in the neighborhood.
But, you know, let me throw in one thing here. If that were to happen, again, there would be the criticism of the Seattle process, which has been known to be this long process, again, where everything gets examined and nothing gets done. So how do you deal with that?
That's a tough one. It's a real tough one. But I think that all of this, for all of these neighborhoods, is really embedded in the whole idea of working with the community. I'm a firm believer that nobody knows their neighborhood better than the people who live and work there. And if we elevate their opinions meaningfully, not to just listen and say, well, we had 16 meetings with the district. I'm more interested in what did you learn out of those 16 meetings? Do the planners actually walk these neighborhoods? For a long time, I've done consulting work with King County Transportation when I first moved to Seattle, with Puget Sound Regional Council. And it always amazed me how many planners don't leave the office. They use models, they use computer models, they use economic forecasts, but they're not walking in the neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's true of the Sound Transit. A lot of staff has come down there and said, I didn't know that was there, or I didn't know how big this was. So it comes back to a major question I have about the CID. Is what's happening to them institutionalized racism? I mean, that's a loaded term, but it seems like there is a racial component to this.
I'm really, how do I put this? Whenever I engage in a research project, I like to look at the elements of race as a foundation. Where were we coming from? Where did these ideas begin? And I think that it's irrefutable that race is definitely an issue in how the neighborhoods in Seattle have been treated and are currently being treated. I think that it would be just impossible to say that race had nothing to do with it. I also think that you have to look at the economics of the neighborhood and the people, which to me elevates the responsibility of our leadership even more, because these are individuals. If you're talking about language issues, if you're talking about having public meetings, if you have a public meeting during the day when people are working or handling family issues, you're going to have a much lower attendance. If those meetings are going to be in locations that are going to be costly to travel to, that's also going to be an issue. So I think that this is an entire package of looking at the history of how ethnic communities have been treated, and some of those issues that are continuing to drag on in contemporary planning.
There's also the issue of language here too, and being able to communicate to a community that, where people speak Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, different languages. That has to be, as we saw that this week, as people descended upon City Hall and spoke and needed a translator to be able to communicate. They have a voice, or in some cases, they haven't had a voice.
Most definitely. For any kind of public meeting, it's the responsibility of the city to make absolutely certain that they have the interpreters there to listen to what is going to be said by the community. I saw this with hearings that were taking place when they were discussing the passage of the Mandatory Housing Affordability Act. And in those first meetings that took place in City Hall, I couldn't believe it, but there weren't any translators. And to have a meeting about something that is going to have such a dramatic effect on in the CID, and not to have interpreters there, and then to just go ahead and think that they're going to be ready to take a vote, it was absolutely repugnant to watch something like that. The lack of responsibility. Even when the project was presented at a following meeting, and they did it at the Nisei Vets Hall, and once the community had an opportunity to read about the proposed upzoning, and when they could read about it in their own language, literally Nisei Vets Hall was packed with people, and the interpreters were there. Now, sadly, I think the city council, the decision to upzone the neighborhood was a foregone conclusion before those meetings had even taken place.
Yeah, I was at that meeting, and yeah, it was. I mean, they were just appeasing the community at that point.
Yeah.
So, as someone that has studied this, someone that knows the history as well as you do, and you see what is happening now, and we seem to be in this stage where the King County executive has admitted that didn't communicate the way people want him to communicate. What do you think needs to happen next? I mean, we're talking about, I think, people being very upset about the shelter expansion, but then the other issue that is also right there is the sound transit issue as well, an expansion of one of the stations. So what now? What would you like to see happen?
Personally, I'd like to see the brakes put on both of them. That they haven't done nearly enough with community outreach, not to tell the community what they're going to do, but to work with the community on solutions that might work. So I don't want to see the city or the county act in haste. And I know that that's going to sound kind of odd because we've had a problem with homelessness for a very long time. But I don't think that building an expansion to the center is really going to answer the bigger question of transition for the people who would be occupying this area. I'm afraid that it will end up like the Navigation Center, which was another project that was just kind of foisted on the neighborhood. As I recall, this was something that was presented in February and open for business in July. So there was really no kind of announcement. There was no kind of interaction with Friends of Little Saigon that were going to be the most affected by the opening of the Navigation Center. Now, Seattle does use some examples of what has happened in other cities. In fact, the Navigation Center was one that was patterned after the Navigation Center, the same name, in San Francisco. The biggest difference, though, is in time and money. That San Francisco knew that if they were going to open up a Navigation Center, that it also had to have a program, a social program, to help people reinstitute their lives, to come back into society. And that the way that was going to happen was to have housing on the other side of the Navigation Center, so that there was a transition. The Navigation Center was looked at as transitional into permanent low-income housing setting, so that they could continue on this, this journey, this social journey of changing their lives. Now, that's something that Seattle didn't do. That if you're going to have a Navigation Center, okay, fine, what next? That if you just build the center and you say, well, we are going to encourage you to engage in drug rehab programs, that an encouragement isn't enough. Okay, so getting back to your original question, what would I like to see happen? Crime in the district has only escalated during the years of COVID. That we already had so few officers that were patrolling in the CID. And in fact, from my understanding, now this is pre-COVID, there were only 2 officers that were assigned in an area that was including parts of Pioneer Square, the CID, and Soto. 2 officers. And that's pathetic. So, all of this, public housing, looking at transitions, if you're going to build these kinds of facilities, that they should be viewed as transition centers to something beyond that. That we need to think about infusing money into the CID. I think the city of Seattle is losing one of its great opportunities to support those businesses in the district that really could bring in substantial tourism money into the city. It's happened in other neighborhoods. It's happened in Chicago. In fact, Chicago is a really interesting case study in itself, where populations are declining in other Asian American communities. Chicago's Asian American community, the Chinese American population, is actually on the rise. Because of the way that Chicago sees money infused into their Chinatown. So I think that this is really going to be a multi-pronged process, and it needs to be viewed in that way, that we're not just building a transit system that is going to connect the North and the South downtown. I'm going to say, yeah, and so what effect is that going to have on the entire community? That there needs to be much more that is done to understand that neighborhood before they take one shovel of dirt.
I think the thing that I think gets me the most is that there's such tremendous history as in the CID, the Chinatown International District, that is, it's there. It is in many respects overlooked. but it is something that I think is so valuable for the city. And it's something that should be celebrated and promoted. And then the economic part of it could be a big plus.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I just don't want it to end up like the Central District,
Yes.
where you have a bunch of
gentrification.
white gentrifiers sitting around going like, why are there black people, so many black people in our neighborhood? That could very well happen in Chinatown, that it could be just erased.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that just can't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing this right now with, the upzoning of so much property outside of that historic area. That when upzoning happens, basically you can never reverse it, because then you would be taking away the value of someone's property and they're going to sue the city for that.
Right.
But high rises being constructed, I don't think there's any question that gentrification is already happening in and around the CID.
Right.
And it makes it all the more pressing for everybody to push back to try to save that neighborhood.
Marie Wong, thank you so much for joining us and really giving us some important history to understand all of what has happened and what's going on now. I think, the past tells you about the present a lot. And so we can learn a lot from that. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right.